Hello and welcome to another ATP Geopolitics video with myself, Jonathan MSP. This is a Ukraine War Update Extra video, giving you extra information tidbits to get your teeth into to give you a greater understanding of the war in Ukraine. Goodness gracious, I say this every time. There's so much to talk about it. I'm clearly not going to be able to do this in one, so it may well be two videos, or the rest will come out tomorrow or whatever. It's up to you how you watch it or not. So let's go to Michael Kofman, who's a great source of wisdom in many things to do with the Ukraine war. And you might ask, who is Michael Kofman? So, Director of Russia Studies at CNA, Senior Adjunct Fellow at CNAS, knows a lot about Russia and the war at the moment. So, he says a few thoughts on the Russian winter offensive, which began 3+ weeks ago. The context of this is I keep talking about whether this is the Russian offensive or not, because if it is, it's pretty underwhelming. And if it isn't, what they're doing are treating all these troops in this pre-offensive offensive. And is it part deep battle doctrine, which is where they attack everywhere like a bit and then find a weakness and then pile into that weakness with a larger kind of second echelon, so on and so forth. Lots of theories about what's going on. Anyway, he says, and has so far yielded little progress for the Russian forces. Poor force quality, loss of junior officers, ammunition and equipment constraints limit Russian offensive potential. The Russian offensive consists of about 5 to 6 axes of attack focused on the Donbass rather than a major push along one part of the front. It is instead a series of distributed battles running north-south from Luhansk to Bakhmut and southern Donetsk. Russian forces are attacking at Vuhledar, Mariinka, Avdiivka, Bakhmut and Belorivka, Kremena, Liman, Kremena, that is towards Liman, with attempts to advance near Kupiansk. The offensive began in the last week of January with a Russian assault on Vuhledar. The battle for Vuhledar involves 2 naval infantry brigades, 155th and 40th, and has not gone well for the Russian military. Russian units refilled with mobilized personnel seem to have lost a fair bit of their offensive edge, but I'm sure that this is a failure. But I'm not sure that this is a failure to learn. The terrain outside of Vuhledar is very open, heavily mined, and covered by the Ukrainian army anti-tank guided missile teams. It leaves Russian forces a few options for an assault. I also wonder if the Russian military may be short on specialized equipment for tasks like mine clearing. At Kremena, the Russian VDV airborne troops seem to have made some incremental gains against UA positions, depending on how the battle plays out. It may force Ukrainians to abandon the Kremena campaign or lead to seesaw battles in the forest west of the city. So let me just put some of that so far into geographical context, because I shouldn't project on everyone else that they know the map of Ukraine as I do, going through it on a sort of daily basis as I do. So if you're not used to watching my mapping videos, what's he talking about? So this is the front line at the moment. We have battles going on, as he said, going on in Kupiansk, sort of Svato area as well to some degree, but not so much for the Russians. It's more defensive. Kremena, Bakhmut, Avdiivka, Mariinka, and Vuhledar, and other kind of potentials around the Zaporizhzhia area. So he's talking about Vuhledar being just an outright failure for the Russians to change their game at all and just continue to beat their heads against a brick wall, getting their forces taken from the higher ground by ATGM teams, by mines and all sorts. And then he goes on to talk about sort of Kremena, which is and at Kremena, the VDV seems to have made some incremental gains. So that's around here, Kremena. There's a forest just south of Kremena, and they're pushing to the west, just basically where you can see that arrow. You can see there's something of a salient there in pink, where they have made some incremental gains. Um, uh, But yeah, so depending on how that battle plays out, it may force the Ukrainians to abandon the Kremlin campaign or lead to seesaw battles in a forest west of the city. There's a growing likelihood that Ukraine will withdraw from Bakhmut to another defensive line east of Sloviansk or Kramatorsk. The Russian military may then turn north and try to consolidate control up to the Donetsk River, including in Belorivka. So again, this is Bakhmut. If they if the Ukrainians pull out of Bakhmut towards Sloviansk and Kramatorsk, then it could be that the Russians, instead of continuing to go westwards, they actually cut up north to Siversk. There's a sort of river bed that they could, or a river valley they could sort of try and get up to hit Siversk whilst coming down from a place called Bilorivka just up there, and basically making this yellow pocket there red, so that you've got a front line that looks very, very much like that. So that's one option for them as he sees it. Yes, so that would consolidate control up to the Donetsk River. And the Donetsk River is this river that goes along from the west here to the east there. So that's that river. Um, Russian forces have not had much success at Avdiivka and or Mariinka. This is another area that's seen months of fighting. The Russian offensive doesn't look like much of an offensive because it is playing out in areas that have previously seen unsuccessful Russian attacks. At this stage, it doesn't seem that Russia has employed reserves and is likely using those units to replace casualties, or perhaps waiting for a breakthrough to exploit. That would be the kind of deep battle doctrine. That said, there's not much evidence of a large additional Russian force in the waiting. This is the conversation I've been having the last week or so, is if this is not the offensive, where are the troops for the offensive? And if it is the offensive, is there a second echelon? And where the troops of the second echelon? There is talk now of troop build up in Zaporizhia area. We've heard about lots of Wagnerites might be in Melitopol. We saw 35 or so coaches going between sort of, I think it's Mariupol and Melitopol. There is talk this morning, I was saying, that perhaps 5,000 troops around the Vuhledar area. So there could be banks of troops in some places, but that's not been confirmed. He continues, I've been skeptical that there is an additional spring offensive looming. To conduct such an operation, Russia would likely need a second mobilization wave in advance, which never took place. Predictions that 500,000 troops would be mobilized mid-January proved incorrect. Senior US and NATO military officials have begun saying much the same in recent days. There's a relative consensus that the Russian offensive to take the Donbass began some time ago, and it's going about as expected given the state of the force. And General Mark Milley's talked about that, and he refers back to that. My best guess is Moscow will wait to see what comes of this offensive before proceeding with a second mobilization wave. I would not discount anything, but right now the Russian offensive looks to yield mostly incremental gains that come at the expense of equipment and ammunition. One possibility is that after the Ukrainian army launches an offensive in the spring, Russia will then choose to mobilize in the summer and attempt another operation later. Given Ukrainian army no longer enjoys a manpower advantage, Russian strategy in 2023 could be to grind away at the Ukrainian army manpower. Russian forces are expending artillery ammunition in this offensive, which they will miss in the spring. The coming months will reveal the real situation in Russian artillery ammo availability, which I expect is quite problematic, forcing them to ration. I think that's exactly right. So the idea that people, pro-Russians, keep saying, oh, you say artillery's running out, ammunition's running out, well, we're still fighting, load of rubbish, ha ha ha, you're stupid, Ukraine-Nazi, all this kind of nonsense. The reality is they are firing far less artillery at the moment. And what explains that? Again, it's inference to the best explanation. You've got two competing hypotheses. Russia have loads of ammo, or enough ammo, they're just not firing it, or Russia are running out of ammo and they're rationing it. What explains them firing an awful lot less? Now, if this is their offensive, they should be firing a shed load more. While there might be a small uptick in artillery usage, are we back to the 60,000 shells used to date? No, we're not. Nowhere near. Or 40,000 or whatever. What explains that? Just you can't bury your head in the sand and just laugh off this idea that the Russians are running out of ammunition, because it really does look that way. That said, Ukrainian forces may also have issues with artillery ammo, absolutely, and barrels. This means a near to medium term challenge. Rosy assessments of Western ammo production potential over the long term might not align well with Ukrainian requirements for the coming 6 to 12 months. Absolutely. Although, the West is trying its hardest to up that production, but will it be enough? Who knows? Ukrainian army is better served absorbing the Russian attack and exhausting Russian offensive potential than taking the initiative later this spring. Having expended ammunition, better troops, and equipment, it could leave Russian defense overall weaker. This is what I was saying before, that don't worry too much about this Russian offensive potentially, right? So say the Russians do have a vaguely, successful offensive that leads them to take the rest of Luhansk and, I don't know, up to Sloviansk. And imagine they do something like that, right? And you think, goodness me, they've taken loads of territory. It's been absolutely terrible. To take that, and just remember how long it's taken them to not quite take Bakhmut, which is just that, like, the little yellow, that effectively that red dot there, right? It's taken them, what, 6 months, stupendous amount of troops, and they've not quite taken Bakhmut. So imagine how much effort, how much they will expend taking this. So imagine they did take this, but where it would leave them. It would leave them completely bereft of troops and materiel and ammunition. Like, the expenditure for taking that would be enormous. Ukraine will bleed them for every meter. At the moment, it's costing them how many thousands of troops per 2,000 troops for every 90 meters they've taken, or something like that, in the last few months. Or it's just absolutely insane. So, as successful as the Russians, in fact, almost the more successful the Russians are in this present offensive, the weaker they will be in terms of a Ukrainian counteroffensive. So I think that's really worth bearing in mind, going forward. So my impression, he says, Michael Kofman, is that Surovikin, who stabilized Russian lines, preferred a defensive strategy, rebuilding the force and preferring to defend against the Ukrainian offensive in the south, then have Russian forces launch an offensive later in the summer to try to capture the Donbass. In fact, this is what Don Nichols was talking about, but he was actually pretty much parroting Kofman in the Ukraine the Latest podcast yesterday. Instead, Gerasimov. So what you've had, sorry, I just finished the original one. So then have the Russian forces launch an offensive later in the summer to try and capture Donbass. So what you had was Surovikin taking over and say, right, we are well overstretched along this front line. So at the time, Russia also had this amount of territory, something like that. Anyway, we'll give or take. And they did Surovikin took over, and he was very much more defensively minded. Said, right, we're getting out of there, and we're going to dig trenches pretty much everywhere up here. Trenches going back, trenches going forwards, trenches doing this, trenches doing that, Dragon's Teeth, all over the place. So he was really defensively minded, and then he got booted out or demoted and moved sideways. And Gerasimov's come in, and then he's been tasked by Putin of saying, right, you got to do something. We got to show some wins. We've got the 24th of February coming out. I've got a big speech. I've got to look amazing. We can't have been involved in the second greatest army in the world and achieve very little. So you've got to show me some wins. So it's like attack, attack, attack. But hang on, we're not ready. Surovikin had a defensive mindset to wait until maybe late summer or midsummer for some. The ground is hard. We can do an offensive. We can reconstitute. We can get the mobilized troops. We can train the mobilized troops up. We can get as much material as possible, and then we can do something proper. So I personally, I think Surovikin had a much better idea about the whole thing. Instead of rushing it, your no army works to you know to targets to temporal targets. You need this by this date. Yeah, but we're not ready. We haven't got you need it by that date. Do it. Okay, but if we try and do that, we're going to be doing a half-assed job and we'll get our asses kicked. Yeah, do it. Okay. Well, there you go. So, so I think Surovikin had a better idea of how to commit the Russian forces to eventually grinding out a win or something close to that, or you know, would do better than Gerasimov. Instead, Gerasimov is exhausting the Russian armed forces with a feckless series of offensive operations, which may yield some gains, like Bakhmut, but unlikely to change the strategic picture. The second battle for the Donbass may once again leave Russian forces vulnerable. I totally agree. In fact, I'd emphasize that even more. A spring offensive will still prove a difficult operation for the Ukrainians. Russian military now has enough manpower and reserves to avoid a depleted front line as in Kharkiv. Kherson is an imperfect but probably a better guide as to how a future Ukrainian offensive may unfold. I absolutely agree. I think all the defenses that Russia put in place means you won't get a lightning counteroffensive from the Ukrainians. It will be difficult. Those trenches and Dragon's Teeth will provide some, cause and pause for thought, and it will make slow going of the Ukrainian advances. Whether Western AFVs, armored fighting vehicles, so any kind of IFV, tank, APC, make much of a difference depends on employment and the timing of the Ukrainian offensive. It's possible if the Ukraine waits for the force to absorb it in quantity, but I suspect this equipment will mostly serve to backfill losses from the next operation. For a bit more on this, I would suggest turning to the WOTR podcast from yesterday and where he talks about it. So, War on the Rocks, very good podcast. Um, that is, I think, perfect assessment because it's what I've been saying for the last few weeks, few months, whatever. Like that fits entirely in line with my thinking. So I completely agree with that. Let me know what you think. Do you think that's a fair appraisal of what's going on? You see, that's 16 minutes, and that's one tab that I've dealt with. So goodness. Okay, let's just swing back to show you a bit of Russian success here. So this is an Avdiivka direction. Russian artillery using the 1D22 laser target designator LTD to guide a 152 mil Krasnapol. So these are decent guided munitions. Russian army for guidance of Krasnopols also using the Orlan 30 drone, which is equipped with a laser designator. So you'll see him put this up in a second. I think there's a video of this. So Russian artillery using according to the video, they destroyed an American counter battery radar ANTPQ. Firing their stuff, but I don't know if there's the evidence of them actually taking that radar out, but there's certainly explosions involved, and just goes to show the kind of range of equipment that you have to do war. Like it's not just like, right, let's get a howitzer, let's whack some ammo in it, let's fire that, and hope that we hit the target. This is precision artillery. So this is the Russians doing what the Ukrainians do with Excalibur rounds, and they'll have some kind of guidance, eyes in the sky. I set up this piece of kit. Do a bit of observation, do a bit of targeting, fire it off. There you go. Look through that, do that, get the target. Don't know what he's saying. He's saying, yeah, look, we're really good. We fire stuff and it hits things, and we can do it in the snow or something like that. I'm obviously being facetious. And Krasnapol is talking about Krasnapol there. This is your really the best of the Russian artillery, ordnance, and pieces. And you hear so much about the Excalibur, but that's not to say the Russians don't have equivalents. Quite how much of this stuff they have, whether this is just for the cameras or whether it is widespread, is for another discussion. Okay, so here I talked about Predsednik77, who's a pro-Russian commentator in the threads, a bit of a bot below. You might say something on this video. He's sent me a video saying, well, what do you say about this? It's chemical weapons. It's a Ukraine video showing chemical weapons, and I did a whole video debunking that because it was ridiculous that as chemical weapons. And he's like, yeah, this is chemical weapons, etc., etc. And he showed this video of all of these munitions. Are like, that's not chemical weapons. And you wouldn't put your own flag on top and then say, look what we've made, a bunch of chemical weapons, because that's basically that'd be implicating you in war crimes, and then you'll be end up in The Hague. Anyway, there's this fridge that gets opened to show more of these pieces of ordnance, which are again not chemical weapons, or almost certainly. Anyway, Magyar, who's this guy that's become quite famous in the Bakhmut area for doing lots. He's in charge of, I think, drones and getting lots of drone footage and looking at how successful they've been and whatever. It might have even been his video originally. He might have been the person talking. I don't know. Anyway, he goes and shows this setup and just says, "Yeah, a load of rubbish." So this rectangular shaped thing is cabinet, and it's where we keep the ammunition, and it's all that ammunition, and it's not chemical. High explosive, fragmentation, literally showing that stuff from that video. Hear it rattling inside? There's a flap there. No need to pull it out, attach it to the drone when it gets carried and dropped there, and blah, 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 blah. Anyway, if you were not sold by my thorough, I think, debunking of what the claim was, then you can literally look at the guy walking around a room showing you it's not chemical weaponry, which is to say, disinformation, go away. Just go away with that. Just stop. It's pathetic. Move on. Right. Thomas Tyner here saying, with Putin's military being annihilated, so there's a bit of geopolitics here, with Putin's military being annihilated and the delusional fanatical Karabakh Armenians removed from power in Armenia, peace between Armenia and Turkey is finally happening. So this is, Armenia and Turkey have a very difficult history, Armenian genocide, Turkey, blah, blah, blah. Go and read up on it. Anyway, this is good news, right? That Russia not being involved, becoming weak in the area, new people being in charge of Armenia, Turkey, Erdogan possibly being slightly surprisingly amenable to the Armenians. It's good news. It's good news. So that's a nice bit of positive geopolitical news. Okay, going to another Dmitry War Translated intercepted call. This is of Wagner. I Want to Live project publishes an intercepted call of. So I Want to Live is please phone up us if you're on the Russian front lines and if you want to surrender yourself because things are terrible and it's rubbish. And they publish an intercepted call of Wagner mercenaries openly ordering the killing of another commander, so one of their own commanders, for Prigozhin's mercenaries. There's no option to retreat. No option to change an unfavorable position or to pull back. This is punishable through execution. So really quickly, Proton, no, to shoot Ustinov, take his group and go into an assault. So that's what we've got a talk between a guy called Proton talking about shooting Ustinov, who is a commander of another group. So I'm muting this and reading out for those who are listening as an audio podcast. So he says, Proton says, be careful. Finish something too. Acrobat, so there's a chat between Acrobat and Proton. So Acrobat says, Proton, they're shooting from all sides because everyone is moving. Everyone is moving. Proton says, so Acrobat, write down from the commander. This is what he has to write down. This is an order. Tell Coyote to shoot Ustinov. Take his group and advance. Acrobat, 1 second. Tell Coyote to shoot Ustinov's group and advance. No, to shoot Ustinov. Take his group and go into an assault. Let's go to the 5th channel. I'm receiving poorly. It's interrupting. Let's go to the 5th. Acrobat, what to tell? Proton, you hear? Acrobat, yes, what to tell? Tell Coyote to shoot Ustinov, take his group, take the radio off Ustinov, obviously, and give it to someone needing it. And Ustinov group will independently move forward to clean up houses. Copy. Now that I've cleared one house, they can jump over it and simply move forward. If he doesn't shoot him, or Ustinov somehow comes here, he, bitch, will be dying slowly. Tell him that. Copy. In other words, yeah, go and shoot the commander. And then take the group yourself and do an attack. So that's what the Wagner are all about. On the eve of the anniversary of full-scale and unprovoked invasion, says Alexei Navalny, who is imprisoned. Still access to Twitter, so this will be someone on his behalf, one assumes. On the eve of, sorry, if you don't know Alexei Navalny, he's potentially the best, well, the biggest threat to Putin in terms of politics if you had any kind of functioning democracy. So Navalny was challenging him, and then he ended up in prison. In fact, they tried to assassinate him on a plane in Germany, and he ended up coming back to Russia, knowing full well he would be imprisoned, and was imprisoned. But what's interesting here, so Navalny, even though everyone's heralding him as the future for Russia, and we want him in charge instead of Putin. Actually, traditionally, he has been kind of pro annexation of Crimea, and so it's not so easy as to say, here's a guy who's an opposition leader, and therefore awesome, everything will be fine. Because actually, there are lots of different levels, of it's not just black and white. There's lots of grey, right? On the eve of the anniversary of the full-scale and unprovoked invasion of Ukraine by Russian troops, I have summarized the political platform of mine and hopefully of many other decent people. 15 theses of a Russian citizen who desires the best for their country. What was this all about, and what are we dealing with now? 1. President Putin has unleashed an unjust war of aggression against Ukraine under ridiculous pretexts. He's desperately trying to make this a people's war, seeking to turn all Russian citizens into his accomplices. But his attempts are failing. There are almost no volunteers for this war, so Putin's army has to rely on convicts and forcibly mobilize people. 2. The reasons for this war are the political and economic problems within Russia, Putin's desire to hold on to power at any cost, and his obsession with his own historical legacy. He wants to go down in history as the conqueror Tsar and the collector of lands. I mean, this is some really good analysis of Putin, by the way. Tens of thousands of innocent Ukrainians have been murdered, and pain and suffering has befallen millions more. War crimes have been committed. Ukrainian cities and infrastructure have been destroyed. 4. Russia is suffering a military defeat. It was a realization of this fact that changed the rhetoric of the authorities from claims that Kiev will fall in 3 days to historical threats of using nuclear weapons should Russia lose. The lives of tens of thousands of Russian soldiers were needlessly ruined. The ultimate military defeat may be delayed at the cost of the lives of hundreds of thousands of more mobilized soldiers, but it is generally inevitable. The combination of aggressive warfare, corruption, inept generals, weak economy, and the heroism and high motivation of the defending forces can only result in defeat. The Kremlin's deceitful and hypocritical calls for negotiations and ceasefire are nothing more than a realistic assessment of the prospects of further military action. What is to be done? 5. What are Ukraine's borders? They are similar to Russia's. They're internationally recognized and defined in 1991. Russia also recognized those borders back then, and it must recognize them today as well. There is nothing to discuss here. Wow. So this is the reason why I wanted to read this was for that number 5. So number 5 is hugely important because it's Navalny actually very clearly saying that Ukraine is entitled to territorial integrity as per the 1991 sort of diktats, if you like. Almost all borders in the world are more or less accidental and cause someone's discontent. Yep, they're the accidents of history and geography. Oh, there's a river there, we'll draw a line there. Borders are just like I've talked about this before. There is no truth out there. The truth is in here. Laws are just what we agree on being the moral laws. And when we do some moral philosophical argument and we say, what's right? Is that 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 wrong? No, that's wrong. That's right. That's wrong. Okay. Do you agree? Yep. We agree. Okay. Let's vote in these guys and they'll change the rules so that gets codified into law. Yep. We voted them in. That's got codified into law. Okay. It's only useful if it's codified into law. If we've got law enforcement to enforce that law and jurisprudence to enforce that and make sure that people adhere to that and give out punishments if they don't, and blah blah blah. So all of those things create laws and blah blah blah. But laws are different through time and place, and so they don't exist out there. They exist in here. Borders exist in here, as in we construct them. They're conceptual. Like if all humans suddenly died, right, there would be no border between France and Belgium. It's just it's not a thing. It's a human thing, and they are accidents of history and geography. And if we want to change those borders, we can, or at least there are lots of different ways you can change a border. You can invade somewhere, like Russia has invaded Ukraine, and you can draw, like they have done on their maps already. Russia, if you look at the latest maps of Russia, inside Russia, they have the annexed regions of Ukraine, the 4 annexed regions, in their latest maps. So they redrawn the maps. Now, if everyone in the world agreed on that, that would be where the borders are. It's all about consensus agreement. The problem is where we disagree on things. So there are things like Kashmir. Like when you look at globes and maps, sometimes there are dotted lines to say, well, no one's quite agreed on that place yet, and people are still fighting over it. Ukraine would be one of those if you took seriously Russia's intentions and claims. But basically, yeah, borders are accidents of history and geography. Anyway, I'm sidetracking. Almost all borders in the world are more or less accidental and cause someone's discontent. But in the 21st century, we cannot start wars just to redraw them. And that's the point. Like, if you're going to redraw a border, like, what do the people live there think? And what do they want? And self-determination, blah, blah, blah. Otherwise, the world would sink into chaos, correct? Russia must leave, number 6, Russia must leave Ukraine alone and allow it to develop the way its people want. Stop the aggression, end the war, and withdraw all of its troops from Ukraine. Continuation of this war is just a tantrum caused by powerlessness, and putting an end to it would be a strong move. 7, together with Ukraine, the US, the EU, and the UK, we must look for acceptable ways to compensate for the damage done to Ukraine. One way to achieve this would be lifting the restrictions imposed on our oil and gas, but directing part of the income. This is a clever move here. This is good. But directing part of the income Russia receives from hydrocarbon exports towards reparations. Of course, this should only be done after the change of power in Russia and the end of the war. So it's Navalny saying, right, I want to open up business with the rest of the world, and that 160 billion euros, 160 million euros a day that we're losing on oil exports, whatever it is, oil and gas exports, if we get that back, like, 60 million of that can go towards reparations that's a day, right? Suddenly, there's a load of money going into Ukraine to rebuild it. It's not coming from everywhere else, but it's also allowing Russia to regain its economic status and to sort out its budget going forward with a change of government. So this is a clever move. I like this. Where was I? Okay. Number 8, war crimes committed during the war must be investigated in cooperation with international institutions. Why should stopping Putin's aggression benefit Russia? 9, are all Russians inherently imperialistic? This is nonsense. For example, Belarus is also involved in the war against Ukraine. Does this mean that the Belarusians also have an imperial mindset? No, they merely also have a dictator in power. There will always be people with imperial views in Russia, just like in any other country, with historical preconditions for this. But they are far from being the majority. There is no reason to weep and wail about it. Such people should be defeated in elections, just as both right-wing and left-wing radicals get defeated in developed countries. He's positioning himself as someone of a centrist here. Number 10, does Russia need new territories? Russia is a vast country with a shrinking population and dying out rural areas. It's a really important point, actually. When you look back at the history of Russia, it had a very growing population, and this was one of its routes towards economic growth as well. So people don't realize. It's like Germany when Merkel took in 800,000 refugees, right? Everyone's like, "Oh, look at her being all like liberal and this." Some people who are anti-immigration, like, "Oh, she's being liberal. She's being all nice to immigrants and stuff like that." And then people on the other side of the spectrum are like, "Oh, how wonderful she's being, like welcoming these people." The reality was, you can bet your bottom dollar, it was an economic decision. It's like we've got a stagnating population kind of growth. The growth has stagnated, and if we want, the problem with capitalism is it just needs like eternal growth. There's no economic system around at the moment, and I'd love to look into alternatives to capitalism, but there is no system that can really bake into it stagnation. And that's a real problem, because it means if you always kind of need growth, then how do you get growth? Well, you usually need more people. Like, if you've people can't just like consume more and more and more stuff. I mean, that can happen to a certain extent, but essentially, you're going to need just more people to consume more stuff to get greater growth. So one way to get growth has been immigration, right? Immigration, as you've got growing population, you need to get young working age men and women in to come and do those jobs and grow your economy. So 800,000 people welcomed in by Germany might have fulfilled some of those other kind of criteria, but would have largely been um, about growing the economy. So Russia going forward has got a decreasing economy, sorry, decrease in population effectively, or very much stagnant. And recently, you had Putin saying, giving sweeteners to people to have more than one baby type thing, to have babies, um, to have children, because they need to grow the economy. It is going to struggle, and if you've got people dying in war and almost a million people, arguably, running away to other countries to escape mobilization, you are in economic trouble. So, yeah, that is a real challenge for Russia. Uh, so sorry, I again completely interrupting myself. Once again, the Russian government is destroying our future with its own hands, just in order to make our country look bigger on the map. But Russia is big enough as it is. Our objective should be preserving our people and developing what we have in abundance. So that's it. Russia is a vast country with a shrinking population and dying out rural areas. Imperialism and the urge to seize territory is the most harmful and destructive path. Um, yeah, and that's the other way you can grow your your population, is by nicking other human beings, like literally marching into their country and say, "You are now all Russian. Thank you very much." So 11. For Russia, the legacy of this war will be a whole tangle of complex and, at first glance, almost unsolvable problems. It is important to establish for ourselves that we really want to solve them, and then begin to do so honestly and openly. The key to success lies in understanding that ending the war as soon as possible will not only be good for Russia and its people, but also very profitable. This is the only way to start progressing toward removal of sanctions, return of those who left, restoration of business confidence, and economic growth. He's absolutely right. 12. Let me re-emphasize that after the war, we will have to reimburse Ukraine for all the damage caused by Putin's aggression. However, the restoration of normal economic relations with the civilized world and the return of economic growth will allow us to do so without interfering with the development of our country. We have hit rock bottom, and in order to resurface, we need to bounce back from it. We would be both ethically correct, rational, and profitable. This is really important. So, this is where, like, Merkel's approach and other Europe's approach to Putin previously has been, the way to change Putin is to globalize and take him into this capitalistic, liberal-minded framework, and he will change. Problem is, he didn't, but then he used all those people to get addicted to his crack cocaine of oil and gas, and then he had a hold over us, and then became even more dictatorial, and it kind of failed. But essentially, that is the right way to do it. It just didn't work with Putin, and for a bunch of reasons. But for what you would hope is that a decent government would take power in Russia, along with having all the democratic institutions and mechanisms to ensure that going forward they had a democratically elected government, and then to reintegrate them into the global framework, exactly as he says there, so that they've hit rock bottom. You need to help them out. There's no point destroying them unless Putin stays there. That's where you destroy them and say, right, if you're going to be a dictatorship, then you know we need to stop that, and we can do that in all these ways and keep the sanctions on. But if you then get a decent democratically elected government in there, then okay, you're allowed back to play. So That's how I would see it. 13, we need to dismantle the Putin regime and its dictatorship, ideally through conducting general free elections and convocating the Constitutional Assembly. Absolutely. 14. We need to establish a parliamentary republic based on its an alternation of power through fair elections, independent courts, federalism, local self governance, complete economic freedom, and social justice. 100%. Of course, these are the ideals of the liberal world. 15. Recognizing our history and traditions, we must be part of Europe and follow the European path of development. We have no other choice, nor do we need any. So he's also courting the EU here, which is this is saying all the right stuff. This is like the perfect world. Navalny's plan, his 15 theses. Absolutely agree with that. Really good stuff. Um, uh, Loads more to talk about. You can see I've only got through half of my ones, but these purple ones are going to be about what Putin said to do with. I wanted to talk a bit about religion actually, but I might keep that for my other channel, my Atypical Philosophy channel, just because it's really interesting looking at the history of religion in the Soviet Union and how he's courting the church. I mean, he talked in his rambling. He had a rambling talk today that was at times, pretty boring. It may be the translator and the voice of the translator rather than his own voice. But goodness me, it was like an hour and 45 minutes or something. Yeah, some pretty bored looking faces in there. But he did say some pretty bonkers things as well. Also invoking the devil, the Bible, scripture. Right, this is really interesting union of a dictator, theology, and the Orthodox Church, and how he can use religion to achieve his own ends, to further his agenda, and using culture wars narrative. So in that, like, goodness me, so it turns out the West is just like literally like pedophiles. Like he had a section on pedophiles, and then he talks about same-sex marriage. He talks about the Anglican Church, going to be, and I don't know if you aware, in the UK at the moment there's lots of talk about whether they will do sort of bless same-sex marriages and whatnot. But he said some interesting stuff about like, but actually we're kind of pro that. So he's kind of trying to say we're not really that hardcore. We won't go into adults' lives, but children, like, yeah. Then we have traditional family values. But if you're an adult, it's fine. And even though there's like huge persecution of LGBT in Russia at the moment because those culture wars narratives have been stoked. Anyway, at times a fascinating speech when he's like talking about stuff like that, which you're like, hang on, you're talking about the devil, you're talking about this and that, you're talking about scripture, but in a really problematic way. Talking about how God doesn't have how the West thinks that God doesn't have a gender. Mate, you need to do some philosophy here because God doesn't have a gender. God's an abstract idea. Like before the creation of if you believe in God, like he wasn't some white guy with a beard, right, mate? Like before creating humanity, made in the image of God means having rationality. Right? That's generally the modern theological understanding of that. He's not some old dude walking around in like not space time because he hasn't created it yet, going, "Hey, I'm a man, yeah, and when I create humans, I want them to call me he," and all this. So just like you need to understand the nature of what God would be if God existed. Um, and Putin is just going, these Western people say God doesn't have a gender. Well, no, actually, really doesn't. If you understand your philosophy. Anyway, lots to talk about that. Loads to talk about energy. Lots to talk about Belarus. I'm not going to have time, so I'm going to save that for tomorrow. But this was also from yesterday. Oh, I'm getting behind. Too much talking. Anyway, thanks for your support. Really appreciate it. All the ways you can support the channel are in the description below. PayPal, buy me a coffee, but just watching is wonderful, and only do that if you have the wherewithal and desire to do so. You're amazing. Thank you. Take care. Speak soon.